This is Jamie Drummond for Good Food Revolution. Today we're joined by two fellows all the way from the Barossa Valley in Australia. We have Allister and Cameron Ashmead joining us from Elderton. How are you today, gentlemen?
Excellent.
I'm also excellent. Thanks, Jamie.
Superb, superb. Now, where are you both based right now? Because you're both in different locations.
We're not that far away from each other.
Right.
So Cam is sitting in his office, and I am in our cellar door, or our tasting room, which is actually the house that both Cam and I grew up in.
Oh, nice. So nice. So for those people unfamiliar with Elderton, would you mind giving us a potted history of the vineyards and the winery itself?
Yeah, sure. Cam, butt in whenever you want, but it's a pretty remarkable story how the Ashmeads came to Elderton. It was a vineyard first planted by early German settlers in the late 1800s, in 1894. It was the Scholes family who planted it, and they only lived and farmed here for a generation. They got an opportunity to sell the place to a famous brandy-making English background family called the Tolleys. And the Tolleys were an absolute dynasty through the late 1800s to the 1970s, basically. And it was the second generation of that family business that bought this property. His name was Samuel Elderton Tolley.
Right.
And he built this amazing house on the property. He planted, well, the Scholes started planting in 1894, but he sold fruit to his family's winery. He also sold fruit to the Penfolds and other wineries, and started an empire. He passed away in the mid-1960s, and I think in family businesses, they typically say that the first generation creates it, the second builds it, and the third destroys it, which is unfortunate for Cam and I, because we're second generation now.
Okay.
That means my three daughters and Cam's three sons get to have all the fun in about 10 years from now, basically. But the third generation of Tolleys fell upon really tough times. So not sure how much your viewers are aware of the Barossa's winemaking history, but the Barossa was first settled by Silesian Germans in the late 1830s. Vines were then planted in the early 1840s, and it was an absolute process of self-sufficiency.
Right.
Obviously, if you wanted to have any fun whatsoever, you had to make it yourself, and so vineyards went in very early. And over the next 130 or so years, the Barossa developed a fine reputation for predominantly fortified wines, so ports in the main. And of course, in the mid-1970s, through a global improvement in winemaking, people stopped putting vintage port on the dinner table, basically, and it threw the Barossa into a big spiral, which many predicted it would never get out of. And
right.
The state government of South Australia was paying growers to pull out 100-year-old vines that today are so very cherished. And the Tolley family just walked away and abandoned the property, basically. And that's where our family stepped into the story. And we weren't grape growers. We weren't winemakers. We weren't even South Australians.
Right.
Our father was a civil engineer and sold Caterpillar tractors. Mum was a midwife. And previously to living in the Barossa, we lived the expat lifestyle for a little bit. Mum and Dad trooped us off to one of the other great winemaking regions of the world, a place called Saudi Arabia, albeit
Right,
many centuries before we got there. And that was the beginning of winemaking for Mum and Dad, because that's the only way they could get a drink. After about a year and a half, Mum in particular said, "I've had enough, let's go home." And through my grandfather, who loved wine and had friends here in the Barossa, they found and fell in love with this amazing house surrounded by 72 acres of derelict old vines in the middle of the township of Nuriootpa. And the real estate agent pretty much said, "If you buy the house, I'll give you the vineyard for free." And that's 40-something years ago. And today, if we were for sale, I think it would be the opposite, that you'd probably get the house for free if you bought the vineyard. So it shows how things have changed. But again, it's a pretty amazing story.
So you've celebrated as a family your 43rd vintage there. So that was 1980, I believe, when your parents purchased the property.
So yes, it happened. The purchase happened in '80, but we only started making wine under the Elderton label in 1982.
I see. And can you remember how your parents adapted to this winemaking lifestyle after not being connected to it previously?
I would say it was probably pretty natural for them, Jamie.
Right.
You know, they're obviously new to the region and so forth. Was surrounded by vineyards. It was they're probably a little bit naive at the start, but they took to it like fish to water. Dad did a winemaking course.
I see.
They drank a lot of wine. They had a lot of mates as well who loved the wine industry, and they just sort of grew into it. And it was a pretty easy decision in the early sort of 80s to actually make our first wine because there wasn't really any other choice.
Right. And how did the two of you fall into the winemaking trade?
Well, for me, you know, it was always in the background. I think it's probably the same for Al as well. I went off after school and worked overseas, which was a great grounding for much larger companies. And I came back in 2003. And Al, if you want to talk about your journey perhaps as well.
Yeah. So I did a general business degree, similarly to Cam.
I see.
Dad passed away in my last year of university, but I was very much keen on coming back into the family business, the family rules. And I think most great family wine companies or family businesses have similar sort of concepts that they tell the kids they're not welcome to come home unless they've studied and they've traveled and they've worked in other places and have a skill that makes the place better when they do get invited back. And so I did a very quick apprenticeship pulling hoses around wineries here in the Barossa and overseas, and working interstate in both retail and wholesale trade, because I knew that the phone call was going to happen pretty quickly. And yeah, I came back in late 99, early 2000.
The two of you were responsible for expanding the vineyard properties, because originally it came with the home vineyards around about the house. But you know, do you source from 4 vineyards now?
Yeah, that's true. We love great wine from everywhere, Jamie. We're real students of wine, and we truly believe that great wine is made in the vineyards. And so Al and I have been looking at the great sites of the Barossa, and now we have 4 sites, 2 in Eden Valley, 2 in the Barossa Valley, that make a whole range of wines, some of which actually come to Canada, some of which that don't. But for us, the future will be all about vineyards, and we're putting a lot of time, money, and effort into the vineyards to make sure that we're producing the best fruit that we can.
Now, what was that old vineyard that surrounded the house? What was that planted to originally? Well, actually, what was it planted to when your parents purchased the property?
So there was little bits and pieces of everything, but mainly Shiraz. There's also some beautiful, very old vine Cabernet on the property.
Oh,
I'm not exactly sure the vines that couldn't be saved and had to be replaced in the early 80s. But yeah, through that vine pool, certainly Grenache and Mataro were varieties that copped it in big ways, and obviously a lot of Shiraz came out as well, because it's always been the Barossa's main grape variety. But yes, we're lucky that this vineyard has a remarkable amount of still very old vine planted Shiraz, and 3 of our 4 vineyards that we own have some amounts of 100-plus-year-old vineyards on them. So it's a pretty amazing armory.
excellent. Now, this is always kind of a cheesy question, but one that's very important just to get a feel for where the two of you as vignerons feel your wine should be. What would you say the overall overarching philosophy of Elderton as a winery was?
Well, for us, it's about making remarkable wines from amazing estate-grown vineyards here in the Barossa. We make wines here in Australia that range between about $16 to $17 up to about $400. And we just love talking to people who love wine. We don't always take ourselves too seriously. We like to have a lot of fun in what we do. But I think the wines of Elderton are in great Michelin-starred restaurants all over the world. They're appreciated by fine wine retailers, and of course the LCBO in Canada has been a remarkable supporter of our little family business. And we're lucky enough to have about 25 different export countries.
I see.
But that said, the vast majority of our wine stays here in Australia. And it's an accolade that we're very, very proud of, that people here in Australia drink our wine.
Superb. Now your wines have been quite acclaimed by wine writers the world over. How important are those scores for you and those awards?
I have to say, Jamie, those scores initially were very important, but I think increasingly in the world of wine, the scores are becoming less important. But that said, we still love it when we get those high 90 scores. But Al and I and the whole winemaking and viticultural teams aren't making wines to do that. We're trying to make wines which are balanced and delicious in the most part.
We have two wines in the market right now, and I have this evening I have the joy of tasting both of them, which is perfect just before dinner. So coming to the end of my day, it's just the beginning of your day. What time is it for you right now?
It's quarter past 8 o'clock.
There you go. Okay. So first I was going to taste, this is the Barossa Shiraz 2020. What can you tell me about this one? This one's available right now, I believe. Yeah, came out on November 18th and sells for $24.95. I haven't tasted this in quite some time. So tell us your thoughts on this one here.
So this really is Elderton's bread and butter.
Yeah.
This is the wine that I quite regularly speak about being our flagship wine, which sounds bizarre because we make wines that are so much more expensive.
Yep.
But the reality is that this is the wine, along with the Cabernet, which we don't have today, obviously, that put Elderton on the map in Australia and really started the export push in the early 1990s. It's the wine we make the most of. It's the wine most people can afford, and in essence, it is a absolutely textbook Barossa Shiraz. So this comes from 3 of the 4 vineyards that we farm. We haven't made we haven't released wines from the 4th vineyard yet. We only bought that vineyard a year ago.
I see.
But it's from vineyards that have ancient soils. There's quite a lot of old vine that typically goes into this blend. The old vines are all hand-picked and then into the winery, fermented in large, sort of about 9-ton open concrete fermenters, which are fantastic for Barossa wines. They pick up colour almost instantly and get pressed off skins after about 6 to 9 days, depending on the ferment, typically, and then predominantly to larger format and predominantly older American oak barrels. I always think of Barossa Shiraz, and this is also a bit cheesy, but I always think great Barossa Shiraz is a lot like a good cuddle. Like, it's just very easy to understand. It puts a smile on your face and just warms you up, basically.
Yeah, it's certainly putting a smile on my face tonight. It's interesting. This is sort of your calling card, and it's a hell of a calling card, because you said benchmark Barossa Shiraz, and it certainly is. In the days when I used to be a wine educator, this would be something I would use to explain the very essence of Barossa Shiraz to students. And it's the same thing today. It's really quite something. It's it's a hell of a complex wine for $24.95, I have to say. And you put most of that down to the old vine fruit?
We don't really. I was just going to say, we don't cut any corners, Jamie, with this wine. Like, we probably put as much input into this wine as we do with our $100 wine, our $400 wine as well. It gets serious time in, great second and third fill barrels as well. So, there's a lot of back end complexity there as well. But 2020 as a vintage was also very interesting. It probably wasn't the easiest vintage to grow fruit in. It was, it was quite warm. So you get something that's a little bit extra special in that, the color coming out of the glass is really dark and thick, and you get a little bit more tannin experience as well with the 2020. So, I think it's one of the better examples of what we've made for Barossa Shiraz.
Now, you said this is your kind of flagship wine. When we're talking about size of production, what is your average annual production size?
We're not. Yeah,
I was going to say it's good. That's a good question. You go out.
It does vary wildly based on seasons and vineyards, and we've been affected by adverse weather effects in major ways over the last 5 or 6 years. But as I said, we're not as big as people think we are. We probably make about 30 to 40,000 cases annually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and that wine makes up a fair chunk of that.
I always like to ask vigneron or winemaker this question, which is, you must have traveled around the world in your ambassadorial roles at so many bloody winemakers' dinners and tastings and all this stuff. What have been the best pairings that you've had with this? Because I think people kind of often misunderstand Barossa Shiraz when it comes to it's actually got quite a surprising versatility at the dinner table. But I'd be curious as to what you've had paired with this over the years.
I've seen everything. It goes from big juicy steaks, slow braisers. I've done it with game like venison and things like that. Goes really well with mature English cheddar. There's been thousands of dinners, as you can probably tell by looking at me, that I've eaten too much. But I don't know. It's hard to put it down to one. Cam, do you have any?
No, I was going to agree. Like, those hard sort of cheeses I love pairing at the end of the meal as well.
Yeah, it does have one of the. It's one of those wines, Shiraz wise, that would be nice after dinner with cheeses. You're right. I think I'll be doing that this evening, to be honest. This is lovely. There's a real fruit intensity on this, but there's also there's like a beautiful mid palate and a nice kind of mineral-y-ish finish and back palate there. It's a really complete wine for $24.95, I have to say, and very, very polished as well, which is something I've always felt about the Elderton range. They always seem there's an awful lot of care goes into the winemaking, it appears to me.